The essence of what we're doing here today is we're going to address superficially, at least we're going to be discussing it, so it should never surprise you when it comes up. It's a core idea that's discussed in Kabbalah and Torah from the beginning of time. As we all know, in the Gemara and Chagiga, the Zohar, the Tikkuni Zohar, it brings the famous story of the Arba Shenichnas Lapardes, of the four great sages and spiritual masters who went into the Pardes. Now, the Pardes is usually the English word paradise, Pardes. It comes from the collection of the words Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod, which really means to ascend the ladder of awareness, of knowledge, of wisdom in a meditative state and go into the higher upper worlds. So for those unfamiliar with the story, it's a long story, it's a very deep story. But basically, there were four great sages, Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, as we know, who's Elisha ben Abuya, and Rabbi Akiva. And these were all masters in Torah, masters in Kabbalah. And they ascended. Rashi says they used divine names of God. So they did what we call Hisbodedus. They went into the highest states of consciousness in truest Pashtus Agashmis. That means their souls left their bodies in the days when that was a technique that people could do on a very high level. It ascended to the worlds. And there were four different responses. So as we know, one of them died, one of them went mad. Acher went off the derech, which is basically said he became a heretic, which means in Kabbalah he saw the angel Matat, and he confused it for the source, the divine, and that's a whole discussion what that is and what that means. And the only person that was able to meditate to the highest state and come out having an incredible experience and all the better for it was Rabbi Akiva. The famous Rabbi Akiva was one of the greatest teachers of all of history. He's also connected to the soul of Moshe Rabbeinu as well, of Moses. And the Zohar and the Talmud teaches there that what was his secret, the language it uses is he went in peace and he came out in peace. There's a tradition that we have from the beginning of time that the result of meditation is not always a positive experience, that there is a risk of a negative experience. And in all spiritual practice, this is discussed. The Baal Shem Tov discusses this in depth, like all the great spiritual masters do. First of all of Kabbalah and all of Torah, whenever meditation was taught, it was always taught to a select few. It was always taught to a select few that had mastered their inner emotions to a certain degree. The famous story of the Marchur, the main student of the Ari Hakadosh, tells, and he brings it down from earlier sources, about when the students used to come to the Kabbalists. I've told you this before, and say, will you teach me Kabbalah? And then Kabbalah didn't mean like a textbook. Kabbalah actually meant the experience of transcendence in all the worlds and how to enter to them. And he was told, have you yet reached the level of Ishtavas? Ishtavas means equanimity. And then the student said, what does that mean, Rebbe? What does that mean, teachers? We learned this story a long time ago together, right? And the teacher said, that means when somebody praises you or somebody attacks you, it makes no difference to you emotionally. Because only then, when you've mastered that level of psychological mastery, of mental health, if you will, right? Only then are you ready to have spiritual experiences without being a risk of being damaged from them. So damage could mean you could become a heretic, you could lose your mind, you could become psychologically unhealthy, and worse, the person could, God forbid, die, because there are angels, there are angelic forces. When we cross the threshold, there's all kinds of things, all kinds of risks and very real dangers. Now, it makes you say, so why are we teaching this stuff? Why are we doing a course for teachers of meditation? Why are we teaching meditation around the world? So first of all, you should know that the meditation of the Pardes was an extremely high level that in our lives we will never know and never get to, by and large, okay, until Mashiach gets here. So you don't have to worry, right? Am I going to go insane or, God forbid, die, etc.? It won't happen. But Nathan's here to tell you it just may happen, right? And what that really means is in the flourishing and renaissance of meditation, of accessing higher consciousness. And in the secular world, on one extreme, that looks like something as simple as and basic and ABC level as mindfulness. And today, with the research happening and cutting edge research happening into DMT, ayahuasca, LSD, there's more and more experiences happening. And in the rush of excitement that the secular world and the New Age world and even the scientific world has about the values of mindfulness, and Torah, of course, encourages that, and the Baal Shem Tov encourages that, then we have to be aware of the dark side. And the dark side is that there's absolutely a certain amount of people, no matter what the scientists will say about the controlled studies of DMT, of ayahuasca. I've met multiple people that said they did those experiments with positive setting and a positive environment, and had psychotic breakdowns from it, right? So this happens. And Nathan's here to tell you today that even in simpler meditations, for a certain percentage of the population, the result can be detrimental, right? And so in one sense, the discussion is about how powerful healing is, how powerful meditation is as a healing mechanism, how important it is for people who aren't perfect of health. And there's tremendous mental health and well-being value to these techniques. But in another sense, for a certain limited amount of individuals, they can have chaotic effects, and some of them can be highly detrimental. I've seen that, yes, with students. Have I seen that with students from Elevation? I've probably taught thousands of students Elevation. I believe I've seen it with 2 or 3 that I'm aware of, right? So the numbers are low. Nathan may step forward and say, no, the numbers are much higher, and we'll enter into interesting discussions. Do you know what I mean? We're here to understand. Nathan's been part of the real scientific research, and as he says 1,000 times, it's still early days in these endeavors, right? So we want to learn what that is. And I think, one of the things that we're going to see and we're going to hear about is, obviously, I think anyone wise will say there's smart ways and healthy ways and responsible ways to teach meditation, and that will minimize risk. But I would add probably not negate risk, because I believe some of the factors at play, which are spiritual, are out of our controls. And there's irresponsible, unhealthy ways to teach meditation inner work, or the people that you may teach it to who are more vulnerable, which is probably going to increase the likelihood of issues and problems. That's not a problem with meditation. All inner work has this risk, okay? There's people that take psychiatric medicine and it causes them to become suicidal, increases depression, right? All personal transformation work can bring up trauma and issues and destabilize a person. The core of it is, the basic teaching, without going into the depth, is Rabbi Akiva was the master who managed to enter and return to the highest levels and integrate them in the healthiest way. And the basic understanding, according to the Hasidic masters, is he entered in peace and returned in peace. That means because he was in a healthy state of mind, of inner peace, when he went in, that cause allowed him to be healthy when he came out. And one of the discussions that had is, when a person goes in and things happen, I've yet to see a scenario where, to the sensitive mind and the perceptive heart, there wasn't signs or indicators of this before. Perhaps Nathan and future research will disprove that, but from my seat where I'm currently sitting today, what I see is everyone that's happened to are people that I saw. It's not like I'm saying I saw that this would happen to them, no. But often what happens is the light comes in. This is an idea in Kabbalah, but there's certain issues they have spiritually or physically or emotionally that rather than the light heal, the light amplifies, which tips the consciousness over. So the core is, the dichotomy is, in one sense, meditation, higher spiritual experience, can heal the troubled mind. But when not done right, or when certain other elements come in, it can tip over the unhealthy mind. Now, if that's not terrifying, it should be a little terrifying, though not paralyzing. And the responsibility is to understand, are there factors that, A, to understand tonight that it happens, B, to understand what are the factors could influence that, right? These important questions. Who are the people at play that could be more susceptible? And, and to know that the risk is minimal, but it's absolutely there. So we're going to have Nathan be our Rebbe tonight. I'm just going to read off this semi-bio, and it's always great when suddenly the hosts go to the reading tone of voice. Nathan's bio, : Nathan received his BA in Religious Studies honors from Vanderbilt University in 2011. I think that's before I met him. He then joined the Clinical and Affective Neuroscience Laboratory at Brown University, where he managed the varieties of contemplative experience study from 2012 to 2015. He received the Francisco J. Varela Research Award in 2012 and began a PhD program in religious studies and cognitive science at the University of California, which took him away from Israel. We never saw him again. Santa Barbara in the fall of 2015, so we're all bitter about that. His current research investigates Jewish and comparative mystical traditions, as well as how science and religion are coming together in the emerging field of contemplative science. Hello, Nathan. Welcome back. Where would we like to begin tonight?
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the bio. Yeah, there's always a question about where to start on this particular issue or arena of different issues. I think I would like this to be a little bit more discussion. I might kind of present a set of information and then maybe hear back from you, Rav Katz, on your thoughts or questions, and then kind of open it up. But I thought maybe I would just...
Would you like me to start with questions? Oh, no, it sounds like you have a beginning point.
No, I think maybe I'll just introduce the study and kind of the research that I've done and I've been involved in first, and then we can kind of get the ball rolling. I do have some slides. I think we'll play it by ear to see if those will be fruitful and helpful, depending on where the discussion goes. But just to introduce the research that I've been involved in. So in 2012, or maybe the end of 2011, I started working at this clinical neuroscience lab, so that studies different clinical and psychotherapeutic disorders and looking at the impacts on the brain and the body. And at the time, it was quite a small side study. I just don't like seeing myself. Okay, perfect. What was a small side study at the time was called the Dark Night Study, was kind of its nickname. And that came out of actually the usage of that term, which goes back to a medieval Christian text by St. John. It has that term, the dark night of the soul, has been taken up by certain Buddhist communities that were reporting something similar or had a nickname for these difficult or distressing or challenging stages of particular Buddhist meditative traditions. And so what we did, when I got to Brown, the study was a qualitative study. It was basically just interviewing people who had had various difficult and challenging experiences. And it was a very simple, open-ended interview. They were basically asking people, what happened? What have you experienced? What sorts of challenges have you encountered? How did you interpret those? And the kind of major dividing line then as now, as there are kind of two major interpretations. One is that, something went wrong, right? And there's a whole host of different things that people have identified as things that can go wrong. Meditation, as I'm sure many of you here are aware of at this point, it can be quite a powerful family of practices. And so like anything powerful, it can be powerfully transformative in, lots of different directions. So one category of interpretation.
Nathan, what's an example of things that can go wrong? What are we talking about here?
Yeah. So just to lay out the dichotomy here. So it can either be that people are saying, ooh, something went wrong and I'm having all sorts of difficult or challenging experiences. We ultimately, out of our interviews, we conducted over 100-something interviews. We broke down 60 or so different kinds of experiences that people have reported, and I can go through those more in depth. Those are what I have some of the slides prepared for. But those can be changes in kind of the cognitive domain in terms of our mental states and our thoughts. We're having a lot of racing thoughts. We're having almost no thoughts. all sorts of emotional changes can happen, somatic bodily changes, changes in temperature and sleep, gastrointestinal things, sense of self changes, all sorts of, particularly in different Buddhist and mindfulness contexts. There's a lot of discourse around different changes of sense of self. And so there are all sorts of changes that people reported on that. Some of those which could be quite impairing, causing people real inability to go to work, go about their daily lives, take care of children, that kind of thing. Also various kinds of social challenges that people reported of being, having trouble relating to other people or seeking out isolation or developing, maybe anxiety disorders around being around other people. Perceptual changes, all sorts of, hallucinations or visualizations that people reported. So that's kind of, again, I can go through that more in depth if people are interested in, but that was really once I came to the project, that was one of our major focuses. It was just trying to get a lay of the land. Like, what is the landscape of what people are actually experiencing? Because that is something that had not been done. And we weren't exactly sure like what the territory was. Are we talking about one thing? Is there one thing called the dark night? Or are we talking about, 60 plus different things? And as different people often reported different clusters of experiences, perceptual changes, which maybe invoked fear and which had other sorts of associations. So the first thing just to note is that it's an incredibly wide territory and there isn't just one thing. There is the category of meditation related either adverse effects, but that already has a kind of interpretation baked into it that neglects the fact that within Jewish and lots of other traditions, challenging stages of the path are often understood to be progress in some contexts. So in that sense, the other interpretation is that no, this is actually a sign of progress along some trajectory of development. These things are supposed to happen. Difficulties are supposed to emerge. We're supposed to alternate between, very expansive states of consciousness and more constricted ones. And that's actually a part of a process of purification, right? So there are these different frameworks, again, within Jewish traditions and beyond, that understand and have reported for hundreds and thousands of years that difficult things do arise. And in some contexts, those are meant to happen. So that's kind of the two major interpretations that both clinicians, right? So oftentimes people do report sufficient difficulties that they seek out clinical help, right? Going to see psychotherapists or psychologists or psychiatrists. But also meditation teachers themselves, right, make these kinds of differential diagnoses when, as you all will no doubt, as you begin having students, right, if a student comes to a teacher and says, I'm experiencing this, it's incumbent upon a teacher to think, deeply about, okay, is this something to be expected? Is this something that's normative? Is this something that actually is meant to happen? Or is one or a number of factors slightly off kilter here and things need to be adjusted to kind of get back on track? So, we interviewed both clinicians, psychotherapists, meditation teachers, and then the meditators themselves and looked at, what was the range of the phenomenology? What was the range of the experiences that people reported? And then how they interpreted them, and then what were some of the criteria that they used in terms of making these different interpretations or this differential diagnosis between either this is part of the path or this is pathological in some way, or some sort of messy mix of the two, which was also true. So just Nathan, as an overview, it is a very messy landscape so far, but this is our way of beginning to start to parse things out a little bit.
Perhaps a suggestion for your first book, it could be The Path or Pathological. What about that?
Yeah, that's something we played with a little bit. Yeah.
Great. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
So that's One is that there's a whole host of different experiences that people are reporting. We're not just talking about one thing or one kind of experience. It ranges along a spectrum of severity. So we were interviewing and talking to people who, both reported having a bad day, having some anxiety, or, some sort of other emotional challenge arise like one day, but it didn't really impact you very much, but something came up during a meditation sit or immediately after, right? So there's the one end of the spectrum of severity, which is that it's not really impairing to one's life at all. And it just kind of arose, and then, and people moved on. And the other end of the spectrum is when, we were particularly interested in more severe cases where people were unable to work or take care of children. That's kind of one of the ways that clinical impairment is understood within the clinical scientific framework, but unable to basically go about your normal life for days, months, and sometimes years, right? So it's a very wide spectrum in terms of severity. It's a very wide spectrum in terms of the kinds of experiences that come up. And it's also, unfortunately, quite a wide spectrum in terms of how people interpret them. In other words, you can have two meditation teachers in the exact same lineage, and the exact same student comes to them, and this happened in multiple cases that we interviewed, and they get absolutely conflicting interpretations from their teacher. One says, "Oh, this is definitely supposed to happen. It happened to me. Just keep meditating. This is even a good sign of progress." And, they have an interview with the teacher the next day, another teacher from the same lineage who says, "This is absolutely not supposed to happen. Something's gone wrong. Why don't you stop meditating, take a break, switch practices, go take a nap, go work in the garden." There's a whole host of remedies. So that's kind of the third thing that we asked about was, what did you experience? How did you interpret it? And then what did you do about it, right? How did you seek to mediate or address some of these difficult experiences? And once again, there's a whole wide range depending on which tradition and your background, and do you have psychotherapeutic training or not, et cetera. So anyways, that's the first thing, is just to just present like a very messy and complex terrain that we're dealing with. And just to, push back against that this is kind of one thing. What most people are most afraid of, and sometimes gets the most press, are the most extreme cases, right? And we certainly do want to avoid, very, very severe impairment. I haven't encountered any spiritual tradition that says, it's a spiritually beneficial thing to spend years being unable to work or take care of children, right? The far end of the spectrum seems like there is some unnecessary suffering going on. And so that's another of the kind of practical aim of this research, is trying to identify, what is unnecessary suffering that people are encountering. That forces us to wrestle with, okay, well, what's the necessary suffering part, And that becomes an incredibly complex question. One framework that myself and some of my colleagues have started to engage with is, just like there are, now very person-centered approaches to medicine in general. So we're also, exploring person-centered approaches to meditation. Again, this is something that has been known and practiced across different traditions, including within Judaism, for thousands of years. It's probably one of the reasons why a lot of these teachings were only given to students on a one-on-one basis, right? That's already in the Talmud. Is that, what's medicine for one person?
Sorry, we lost you for a second there, Nathan.
Sorry. What was the last thing you heard? So what's medicine for one person may be poison for another. And that's why these, person-centered approaches have been practiced, historically in these different traditions. And in some sense, we're trying to catch up to some of that wisdom today in more of the clinical domain and in terms of, mindfulness practices in this. So that's kind of a general overview. Maybe we'll stop there and open up for questions or comments.
Great. So let me just ask a question to begin with. Do we have any idea of kind of what numbers we're talking about? How common are these issues? And you've obviously mentioned a broad spectrum of issues. Do we have an awareness of, I know you were doing some research into Vipassana at one point. Is there any reference points for X kind of meditation or X kind of approach? We're seeing this statistically amount, or the issues more like in this category, there's a big issues, or this category less, etc.
Yeah, so there's just starting to be some research on that. So generally, because most meditation studies historically have not asked about or looked at or even reported the adverse effects that came up in their own studies. So the first thing was just like bringing this issue to the table. And, most meditation research is now starting to reckon with like, okay, we not only need to report, when these things happen, but we actually need to ask people, because not everyone will actually just, disclose if they happen. So that's the first thing, that it's been grossly underreported so far. We, in our study, which was a qualitative study, was just trying to get a lay of the land to then be able to do more of the quantitative research that you're talking about, more specifically, and to do it more effectively. There has started to be that research. There was a study that came out, I think, last year, and I can post all these papers if people would be interested. And I believe that was something like just a questionnaire for about 1,000 people or something. And I think it was something like 40% of them reported some sort of adverse effect. The major ones were anxiety and depression that were associated with meditation in some way.
What's the practice that was leading to this?
Well, so it was a questionnaire about going out to meditation practitioners across different practices. So this was more of just getting a sense of how widely adverse effects are reported across traditions. There hasn't yet been research done specifically looking at, what percentage of people doing Vipassana are encountering adverse effects? What percentage of people doing, centering prayer or Jewish meditation or things like that? That research has not been done yet. There has been some research coming out of our lab, actually, that was looking at differences between mindfulness practices. So, mindfulness-based interventions are consisted of generally two families of meditation practices, what are called focused attention practices, which are often focusing on a part of the body, focusing on a particular word, like a mantra. The point of the practice is really to develop the capacity for attention. And so there's one object of attention. It doesn't really matter what it is at early stages. We're just trying to bring our attention back over and over. Whenever we get distracted, we bring it back. So that's generally called focused attention within the research world. The other family of practices are what's called open monitoring, and those come more directly out of Vipassana practice. It gets confusing because both of them are called mindfulness. Both families of practices are taught within mindfulness-based interventions. So even mindfulness itself isn't a very helpful moniker if we're actually trying to get to practice-specific effects, like what were you doing and what happened. And what the study that came out of our lab was a dismantling study where it's saying, okay, mindfulness-based interventions already are a whole host of practices. There are these two families of practices. There are also body-based practices. There's also practices of just being in community with other people, which is incredibly powerful in itself and may be responsible for a lot of the clinical benefits that mindfulness has reported. And that was another study that came out of our lab recently. But it was just trying to dismantle, like, okay, what practices are doing what and who might they be better for? And very preliminary research coming out of that study showed that the focused attention practices were better for people with anxiety. And the open monitoring practices were better for people with depression. And the flip side was also true, that the open monitoring practices could actually be contraindicated for people with anxiety. Open monitoring practices or Vipassana is just becoming aware of whatever thoughts, feelings, sensations arise in that moment, just noting them through different ways and then letting them go. And what seems to be the case is for people who are already very anxious to learn to become attentive to everything that's arising moment by moment can actually amplify your anxiety. Right. But the opposite also for the focused attention, that for depression, for people who tend to ruminate, right? Rumination of constantly experiencing the same string of thoughts over and over and not really being able to break those thought patterns. The focused attention could sometimes be problematic or challenging. And that's where open monitoring of learning to see all of the different thoughts we have and not fixating just on these ruminative thoughts was very helpful. So, but that's, again, it's all very preliminary because we're just starting to really, explore these questions. And especially in terms of more, quantitative methods of looking at different demographics, looking at people with trauma or other comorbidities and which practices might be better and what experiences they're having and reporting. So
Nathan, when you do such a study, and you've emphasized multiple times it's a preliminary stage, how many people do you study doing both those different practices to be able to kind of give a result like people with anxiety, this is better, people with depression, this is better?
Yeah, so I'll have to look back at the paper, but basically that was a study that was done over 5 years, and there were different cohorts of I think around 20 people, and they would go through the 8-week program. And exactly how many cohorts did they have? I mean, several hundred is roughly the size, and then you would do one cohort where you had both practices, and then one cohort just with one practice and one cohort with the other. And then, the fourth would be the two again. So that was the general design of that study. So you had, a couple hundred people that you're looking at. Again, it's
fascinating because, we've been learning a lot of the different nuances of Kabbalah and Hasidus and different meditation practices. So even in a category that you would say is a single focus on a single thing. So we did a whole section on his kashrus, and there's all different levels of his kashrus when I'm connecting to something, right? So I may just say a mantra, I may say a word over and over again, okay? So that's called derech chazara, to repeat a word over and over again. But as we've learned from many different texts again, and in the last few months, the thing that you focus on itself can deeply affect the meditation experience. So if you do, for example, TM, while they say that this word is neutral, it's actually the name of Hindu gods. And they themselves would actually say it's not irrelevant, the word that you have, because there's a certain power, frequency, energy on that. So we've been learning about his kashrus. If I put my attention on this cup and I focus on a cup, and I'm doing that as, let's say, a psychological practice of meditation, of bringing myself back to the glass, I'm going to have a different result if I'm focusing on a mezuzah. Or we talked about, the makava before, the picture, because that has a particular energy or frequency of that. That's why we turn towards the Beit HaMikdash when we pray, or Yerushalayim, because we're fixing on a single point, but the point itself can have a different frequency, energy, which affects our capacity to focus on the outcome as well. So, as you said, these are preliminary studies, but it's interesting. Like, I wonder how sensitive scientists could also be to the wisdom traditions that actually talk about this energetic nuance in that which you would choose to start to focus on. So is there awareness of those kind of things? I mean, I've met Willoughby, and I know she's intelligent enough and interested enough to kind of at least consider those options, but I don't know how much they could come into the realm of the research.
Yeah, so it's a great point, and it's definitely true that even within that focused attention family of practices, there could be a lot more detail and nuance in looking at, what people are actually doing. That would usually fall more within more qualitative studies that have more time to really be asking and interviewing people more in depth. Okay, you said you're doing this practice, but can you walk me through it? What were you actually doing? How many hours a day? What, getting to all of these much more nuanced and really crucially important effects, which is why on more the applied side right now, we are emphasizing, right, this much more individualized approach to be working with people, because there might be really dramatic differences in whether you're focusing on a mezuzah or on just, your cup of coffee. And those would have a whole host of repercussions for what you're actually doing and what you're experiencing, and then how you may want to address whatever's coming up through that practice. So, there are qualitative studies. I am currently doing one of those qualitative studies, which is, in-depth interviews with people to try to get at some of these effects. It's just once you take it to the more quantitative level, you lose a lot of the richness and the complexity, because you have to isolate certain variables to be able to ask hundreds, if not thousands of people. And, so that's really the tension in the different research methodologies.
Just to speak out to the group, one of the things that profoundly interests me about this subject, and it goes to the core of things we've been teaching about whether, the Zohar's prediction, where the two waters meet, that Mashiach is going to come. And the final revelation is going to come when the wisdom, the higher wisdom of Kabbalah and the lower wisdom of science meet together. So this is part of concluding things we began the course with, part of the messianic prophecy that both these realms are necessary and both these realms absolutely have a contribution. But on a base level, what you see is that I met some of Nathan's team and the people Nathan's working with, and we went out to the Mind and Life Institute, and we dialogued then. It was really fascinating and to meet with them and to hear their approach. But it's the same with what you see in the psychedelic research. And in the research of psychedelics, they have to map out on a philosophical, scientific level, what is the phenomena people are experiencing? And to that, they have to say, well, there's this thing called the spiritual experience. And what are the 12, 10, 8 main elements of a spiritual experience? So what you see is, even in what Nathan's saying, if you're going to have a deep understanding of which meditations have caused which psychological effect, so we have focused attention in one area, and then to test that, you have to say, well, focusing on different things, if something called something holy or something as a part of a wisdom tradition has a higher frequency, or whatever the term is going to be called, and then they start to be able to map out, look how these focusing on these things, it's like the work of Bill Bankston that we researched, look how these things have a higher frequency and affect the consciousness. So a focused attention on a glass, hey, look, that can increase anxiety, but focused attention on a mezuzah, that actually decreases anxiety. So is it about the attention? Is there, and then science begins to ask a question, is there a possibility that something can have an energy, a frequency, we call that the spiritual influence, that begins to affect it? So what you see is that science is reaching a threshold and crossing a bridge where spiritual nuance matters and impacts the result, potentially. We would say from a Torah perspective, absolutely, that's where they're going. And from a science perspective, they have to say, well, we have to research that, right? But what you see, it's an extraordinary moment in history where, science, as we said from the beginning, begins by rejecting spirituality, right? But then it returns to the path of spirituality, but now in the language of science. That's why advanced science is the language of Kabbalah for the final generation. So it's very always interesting in these discussions with friends like Nathan to kind of see the sensitivities that scientists need to develop are ultimately spiritual sensitivities to make sophisticated nuance in the research that they're doing. I would like to take, before Nathan continues, I'd like to take a moment to open up any questions to him, to me, to the group. People may be asking more about the science, more about the research, more about what Nathan's seen in other wisdom traditions, because I know they've done a lot of fantastic work there. People may want to ask more about particular spiritual experience. I have worked with a bunch of different people of all kind of different breakdowns, and we can talk a little about what my understanding is from Torah, about what can cause these things, what to do about these things. So let's just begin. I don't want to spend don't want to spend half an hour on questions right now. I want to spend 5-10 minutes on questions. We can bounce back to Nathan. So who'd like to begin with something? Ilan, and I just request if everyone can keep the questions sharp and tight so we can keep the train moving forward and cover as much ground as possible tonight. Yes, sir.
Nathan, thank you so much for your time. I really found what you've thus far expressed very interesting. I'm really intrigued by the whole dynamics of exploring the mind and the brain and meditation. So I just wanted to find out whether or not you've become aware of the Patrick event from the Robert Monroe Institute. And I just wanted to draw a bit of an attention with the thoughts that thoughts are like garments. And this is really a question for both the Rav and for Nathan, that we learn, in deep Hasidic thought, especially through Chabad philosophy, that really the soul expresses itself through the thought, speech, and action. And thought is really a garment. And if you continue along that path, just like a garment, if you put a really big garment on a very small child, he won't be able to walk and he could be trapped inside that garment itself. So my line of thinking was that, sure, we believe that everybody is divinely created, and that level of divinity is so mitzamtzem, so constricted, infinitely constricted, so that it doesn't actually affect us on a conscious level, but to a point that we could actually trap ourselves and trap our consciousness within a belief. So the question, to focus it a bit more, is that if we have beliefs, I wanted to just see if you could elaborate a little bit on whether or not beliefs, they're thoughts. Thoughts are ultimately beliefs, but beliefs are obviously a lot more integral part of a person than just any kind of thought that's popping in. So I wanted to see if you could explore a little bit more about the difference in meditation that people experience from the negative perspective, whether or not, if they come from an atheistic perspective, or whether they come from a godly, some type of monotheistic perspective, whether that has a bearing on their success or failure in meditation.
You want to take this, Nathan? Do you want me to start?
You could start.
Okay, so the same, as I was following, Ilan, you were going in one direction with a general commentary, and then you spun in a different direction at the end. So let me double back together, and then Nathan will follow up. First of all, the idea of, that a person can lose themselves in their thoughts of belief, that the clothes can be bigger than the child and the child can't walk. So this is everything we've discussed before. This is what's called in the mystical writings, dat begalut. Consciousness goes into exile. And we've said that there's 4 levels that goes into exile with us, right? That means we have, that today we call intense clippers, intense beliefs, right? We call that trauma, right? And what that means is a klippa kasha. It means that there's beliefs compact with emotion, compact with a body energy, compact with an image or thinking. And then there's a fifth. Every 4 which has a hidden fifth in Kabbalah, which is the energetic impact. That means if I experience something intense and negative in my life, or positive as well, that means there's a body energy that goes into the nefesh level. There's emotion behind it. There's an image, a memory association, visual association. And then there is the belief. I'm a victim. It's terrible. I was abandoned alone. Now, all of the challenge of human consciousness, as we said from the beginning, there are 3 states of consciousness development. Right, and going back to things that we said early days, the first is that we all live as a behemoth, unconscious, right? And that means we're controlled by dinyon. That means we're constantly our lust, our fear, our doubt, our ego, our shame. That's strong and intense within our body. It feeds up images and memories. When I'm talking to you, I'm not really talking to you. I want something for you. So suddenly you're wonderful, or you betray me, so suddenly I hate you. So I'm never really seeing the you. I'm never really seeing the world. I'm seeing my projections of the world. So that's the unconscious level. That's consciousness in exile. I'm not aware of myself, my true nature, my true essence. And then and that's called the unhealthy self. And then there's called the healthy self, where there's the me, and then all those other parts, mirrors, separate elements of my consciousness, and I can heal them, and I can release them, and I can elevate them, but there's a me that's separate to do that. And the third is what's called the Das Elyon, which is the Dveikus, which is when I can evolve to become super conscious, more of that. So first of all, I just want to use the Torah language for these things. This is a midah, this is called a klippa, and basically the human condition is for all of us, the identity with Dimyon, the identity with illusion, the identity with feelings is more real for us than the objective reality. So the mystics, the Bali Musa would say, the first step of health, of growth, is to move from Dimyon to Metzius, is to move from my projections onto reality, perceiving the true reality, right? And that's what it means, that all of us have the ego self is greater than the conscious self. The nefesh Bahamas is greater than the nefesh Elokis, right? The midas are greater than the das or the moichin. And that's the first step of evolution. The basic mindfulness practice called Yeshiva Dat is really just an awareness that all these thoughts coming up and all these sensations are not me. That's the revolutionary power of simple mindfulness. It's simply, there's that anger, there's that pain, there's that yesterday thought, there's that tomorrow thought. Hey, the fact that I can watch it means it's not me. And disidentifying with the noise allows me to re-identify with my source and self. And then I'm a human being. I'm not actually doing anything yet, but at least I'm remembering who I am, and that itself is a beginning point. So as to your first point, that is the essence of what we call tikkun hamidus. That's the essence of the binyan of das, is to return to the self. The second point, now I don't know if there's something Nathan wants to comment on that or add to that, but the second point, that what you turned into a question, and it's something I'm particularly curious, to ask Nathan. And this, once again, this is not tonight's discussion about psychedelics, but this also comes up tremendously in the research on psychedelics. Is the question is that if a person has a belief, a part of a particular religion, versus a person that doesn't have any belief in a particular religion, when they go into a higher state of consciousness, do those beliefs affect what they perceive? How do they affect what they perceive? How did, as Nathan said, how does it affect their experience? How does it affect their interpretation of the experience? Right, those kind of distinctions, and there's a lot of, we can talk about our theories and understanding of it. You should know that in Kabbalah, this is discussed frequently, that the tikkun hamidus, the purifying of our emotions and our perceptions, that as I said before, if you want to learn Kabbalah, his Buddha is transcendent, supernatural, experiential Kabbalah. The first thing you have to do is purify your emotions, and that's not just so you don't get broken when you go up there. The deeper reason is so that when you transcend into those worlds, you have what's called an aspeclaria meira. You have a perfect true perception, because our perceptions go with us when we arise. That's the secret of dreaming, and dreaming being 1/60th of prophecy, which means that when I receive a true divine download in dream, it's refracted through my beliefs, my lust, my pain, my ego, my trauma, my doubt. So the more I purified consciousness, the more I saw the truth of reality, then the more when I went into the higher world, I could attune to the energetic spiritual truth that was happening there, right? And that's part of the learning of Torah. Again, I can talk about what the sources say, I can talk about my own experiences. The more I've worked on my own stuff and the more I've learned what the texts say about the worlds, then when you are given those gifts and moments to open up into the worlds, then you see very clearly what's happening there and know how to interpret that, which is the essence of prophecy. Because the Rambam says that when you receive the prophetic lights, it gets refracted through your dimon, through your imagination. And therefore we must purify our consciousness and life in a development to perceive that, not just the physical world objectively, that's called psychologically healthy, but the spiritual world objectively, which is the higher spiritual truth. So when a secular person, whatever that stupid word means, a non-believer, whatever that means, the Tanya himself would say, when someone put a gun to their head, they would still die for the truth, because they had something called the Muna, which is L'malam and Atamadas. They have a part of our consciousness which is higher than our perceptions of this world. But when we prophesize, but when we go into meditative state, when we have a psychedelic experience, we are still perceiving through the filter system of Das Tachton. And therefore, there's a lot to say about this. We could give shiurim on the subject. It's still a filter system for us. So our ultimate soul is pure and above it. But even the next world, that's the secret of the Chalukah de Rabbanan, the degree that we purify ourselves in this world will determine how much true perception we have in the next. So our beliefs in this world, when we transcend, we're both above our beliefs, but still susceptible to be influenced through that unclear filter. So they're two different things to hold in mind. Rabbi Fischer, what would you care to add to this, or take it in another direction as well?
No, first of all, I may start having to take questions first, because I don't want to clean up after you anymore. But I think, I mean, you raise all the key questions that are, just as valid as you mentioned in psychedelic research about, set and setting. So what is the mindset, and how are our beliefs like shaping the experiences that, people have in psychedelics, but also for meditation, in a lot of meditation cultures, particularly the Asian ones that have become so influential in Western cultures, there was a concerted effort not to talk about difficult and challenging experiences that are reported in, the Buddhist texts too, because they were afraid of scripting people's experiences, right? That if they had these expectations like, oh, well, if I'm going to become enlightened, I'm going to need to go through these difficult things. And then so they're kind of auto-generated, or, they're not actually going through in an organic way, but they're kind of, the experiences are being scripted. And they specifically, I mean, there's stories about how, like, people at monasteries in Burma and India, they would hide all the English books where it had all this stuff so that they couldn't like see any of this stuff. And part of that is, comes out of a good intention, which is to say, we don't want to script people's experiences. We don't want to, shape them into having unnecessarily negative experiences. But the flip side of it was that when people would encounter various difficult experiences without having any background, so then they would often think, well, whoa, I must have done something really wrong because I heard about all this good stuff that's supposed to happen in meditation, and I never heard that any of this bad stuff. So they no longer had, a framework and to know, and oftentimes just like normalizing, right, these things and say, no, like these are experiences that have been reported for hundreds of years. They're kind of natural trajectories that people go through. You're going to have very expansive states. And particularly when you start getting into very expansive states, you can probably expect that there's going to be some oscillation between not just normal, but maybe even more constricted ones. So that's where people got sort of left out. And then they got angry at those teachers that kept that information from them because there was some unnecessary suffering that they saw that was caused by the withholding of that information. So getting the balance right between full disclosure, and keeping information back in a developmentally appropriate, and healthy manner, that's a really tricky line to get right. Once again, it's why, in traditions like Judaism, this stuff was often done on a one-to-one basis, because it could say, hey, okay, you had this experience, go check out this text, you'll see like this is par for the course, but I didn't want to give it to you ahead of time because I wanted it to naturally arise, or I didn't even know if it was going to arise. It's something that can happen, but I have no idea if this is something that you need to go through. That's part of your own process of, working through your midot, or purifying various midot that you have. So, again, this is where it becomes like a very delicate balance. But these are all the big questions.
This I want to add a certain point of a very practical Lamaisa point from everybody. Part of the truth about all spiritual experience, the modern words are set and setting, and the ancient word is the kavana. And we've said kavana has 3 levels. Kavana means intention, attention, and emotion. Okay? Intention, do you have an intent of what you're going to do or why you're going to do it, what you want to achieve from it? Attention, you completely give it your full attention and focus and self as you're doing it, and emotion. There has to be emotional, full consciousness engagement in it. So again, breaking down kavana, intention, attention, and emotion, that basically breaks down to Das Elyon, Das, and Midas. Again, the 3 levels. When you fix an intention, choosing to believe it in the way that we've learned before, that is triggering your higher consciousness, the angel, the guardian angel, the higher consciousness, and the energetic angelic influence around you. That's what's opening you up to that possibility. That's connected to Koach HaMoshe, the law of attraction, as we've learned. The essence of tefillah is to kabel b'ratzon, that Hashem receives what's in our higher will, our keta, our dat, elyon, our ratzon. The attention is what we're doing with the conscious self, the mindful self, right? I have kavanah to feel. I'm actually paying full attention to the words. I'm working on what Rabbi Nachman says, the law of attraction. I'm going into the vagus and I'm picturing everything I want to see, and I'm giving up, sacrificing for that. I'm bringing down the light. So that's what I'm doing with my mind. And then I must engage with Av and Yira, with the emotion. So what I want to extend, which is key to what Nathan is saying, is in psychedelics, in meditation, the student knowing that this will trigger a spiritual experience helps to trigger the spiritual experience. That's not incidental. Because when you go to do something and you realize, I'm going to say these serufim of letters, as we've learned, I'm going to do the makava, as we learned, right? I'm going to do rikas and makshava and map out. Because by doing that for 5 to 10 minutes, I know that opens me spiritually. You're actually creating the angelic, spiritual, higher conscious potential that it should have that effect. So telling somebody what's going to happen helps cause it to happen. Fixing the intent helps cause it to happen. Parenthetically, as we've learned, the biggest block to having a spiritual experience is your desire to have a spiritual experience. When you're sitting there waiting to launch out of my body for 5 minutes because that's what it's in the book and it doesn't happen, that's because you're so ego invested and anxiety invested in happening, it doesn't happen. So, but that's not what we're talking about right now. So therefore, when you tell someone, let's say you're running a bunch of meditation classes, workshops, as we've learned, and let's say you turn around to everyone and say, by the way, before we start this, a lot of people have psychotic breakdowns when they go in. It can really bring up tremendous fears and anxiety. Then you literally induce that. So I want to validate the challenge, the dichotomy that Nathan's saying by first acknowledging that you do. It's in modern language, it's called hypnotic suggestion. Hypnotic suggestion means it's more than psychological, that I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, and that's going to cause it to happen. And you do use that. You use that to create the set and the setting, number one. And therefore, you don't want to say, let me tell you all the dark things can happen, because not just psychologically, that actually induces actual fear and actual anxiety, which will crush the meditation experience, but because by spiritually, it's attuning their soul to that. So one is, don't do it. But two is, as Nathan's saying, there's a degree of irresponsibility, because here's the key thing that happens. And there's a lot, I could literally give Shimon on this, and one day, B'ezrat Hashem Bli Neder, I will. Part of what happens in psychotic breakdowns is it begins with a spiritual energetic awakening, but then the person does not know how to interpret what is happening to them. It is said many times, there's a very, very fine line between a high spiritual experience and a complete psychotic breakdown. And one of the lines that people cross is as the light comes in and as they leave the body and as they get the downloads, there's a panic. The ego panics. Am I going to lose myself? Am I going to lose my mind? Am I going to get overwhelmed? And it's the panic itself which brings up trauma, doubt, fear, loss. And then the light hits that and amplifies it. And that can smash the person to pieces. And then the crumbling happens. So part of what is essential in teaching meditation, there's a line one of my rabbis uses is, and Nathan, I think this is the answer to the dilemma, is you have to learn to give the light without the heat. To give the light without the heat. Does anyone get where I'm going with this? You have to be able to say to someone, there's risks, and the risks could look like A, B, and C. And if you have A, B, and C, this is what you're going to hold in mind. But not to add emotional intensity about this. When you have kids, especially in our generation, you have to teach kids that there's bad people out there who do sexually bad things to kids and what to do. How do you not traumatize your kids when you do that? People come to me all the time saying, how do you not? And I did traumatize the kids. The answer is because the parent is so upset and anxious and overwhelmed by that when they tell the kids, they put the fear of death in it. Statistically, most kids probably won't happen to them, but many more kids will be traumatized by the parents telling them what's going to happen, right? So the answer is you have to give the light without the heat. We're going to have the most amazing experience. This will cause us to jump out of our body. You add the passion, the light there. And then you say, in a very chilled way, again, don't say it before. Introduce this sometimes. Don't do it all the time. In case anyone would ever happen, this, or this, here's some of the challenges you could see, but don't worry, that's totally normal, etc., because of that, and that. So you do inform it, but you don't do it in a way that has emotion. And you don't do it in a way that has intention. You only do it in a way that has brief attention. Here's some information. Here's what you need to hold in mind. And really, it's fine. It hardly ever happens to anyone. It's not, I always say the following thing. If you ever see me say this in a session, or if I talk about this, I always say it statistically hardly happens to anyone, and it's not going to happen to anyone in the room today. You're all fine. What did I do? I just fixed an intention for them. Then they go,
Can I jump in on that?
Go on.
Just with a one-liner, when this actually happened to me in my own spiritual experience, and that's why I'm enrolled in this course, to be able to facilitate spiritual experiences as a teacher. But when that actual point, that cutting edge point, then when it happened to me, the fear and my heartbeat raced when I was completely relaxed and I was perfectly in tune. And it happened so abruptly that it startled me. And the only thing that I could hold on to was, wow, if this can happen in a negative sense, then it must also be able to happen in a positive sense. And I saved myself the shattering experience, and I went into the whole experience. So I was able to ground it that way. But it was like, I can't even put it into words, but it was huge.
That's really, really profound. When I've had to counsel people having psychotic breakdowns of experience, it's not something I've done a lot. And my normal approach is to refer people to professionals, so much more qualified than me. But there's certain situations in life when someone's in front of you right now and they're turning to you right now. Usually what I'm doing is I'm telling them, you're experiencing what you're experiencing. Don't resist it. Don't panic to it. There's also a good light in there. You don't have to believe the thought you're seeing. And you talk them into a place. And the thing that was a nightmare suddenly becomes a dream. Right? And this is also, if in the world of psychedelics, it's the same thing of having a bad trip. Right? That if you can orientate a person back to themselves and back to their body, keep their, shift their thoughts over. It's the same experience. There's light coming in. When I've worked with multiple people in their life who have had psychotic experiences, often from a spiritual experience, there's 4 elements that I've noticed. You may want to write this down and hold this in mind. Number 1 is they're exhausted to begin with. They haven't slept in days. They've been working extensively. And they're just generally exhausted, right? Tired. Now, what that means is, remember, our das, our conscious awareness, which is also a steering wheel for our minds, is rejuvenated and returned to us through sleep. So when you lack sleep, you lack the control function to shift the energy or reframe the energy when it comes in. We all know when we're tired, we function less. We're more likely to be irritable, more likely to be triggered. That's because our steering wheel of the mind is less behind the wheel. Fine. The second is a spiritual trigger. That means, what is it? What's it called when people come to Jerusalem and go mad? Jerusalem complex. They all think they're Mashiach. So first of all, the das is vulnerable. Second of all, there's some light or energy that comes in. Someone told me, a woman came to me that had for many years psychotic breakdowns, and the first time it happened, she was working at a religious conference in America, and she hadn't slept for days. She was busy, right? And then the whole group said the Shema together. 500 people said the Shema together. So in that vulnerable state, by the way, when the das is weakened, that makes you vulnerable. But by the way, weakening of das is weakening of the yeshus, which opens you up to spirituality. You understand? That's all of meditation, is to take out the das to open up to a greater light. Unfortunately, when you take out the das, you can also open up to greater darkness. That's why in high-level spiritual experiences or psychedelic experiences, people often crash into hell or they soar into the world because it's knocking out their conscious control. So energetically, what they're attached to more will send them up or send them down. So first of all, there's exhaustion or lack of a vulnerability of das. Second of all, there's a spiritual trigger, which causes the influx. Third of all, also in their life at the time, there's usually a degree of stress, anxiety, trauma, emotional turbulence. So this woman was also going through issues with her children, with her husband. So there's general anxiety. She's not so conscious because she's tired. She opens up to a spiritual experience. So what happens then? The light floods in. There's no way to hear it. There's no way to control it, right? There's general emotional turbulence. And then what sends them over is panic. Is not the experience, but the interpretation of the experience. If they don't actually have the model in a lot of wisdom traditions, you know, the spiritual breakdown was actually a spiritual breakthrough. And today, some people we brought in a psychiatric hospital could be actually having a high spiritual experience, but they don't have, you know, the elder to teach them. This is how you accept the light. This is how you release into it. Here's how you channel the flow. It's like surfing a wave, right? A very powerful wave in surfing. So that the panic goes, oh no, I'm losing my mind. Some people have ego panic. Some people have abuse and they've lost control of their body and they feel it's happening. And that's then what crashes the whole system. So you've got exhaustion and loss of das. You've got a spiritual trigger that opens an influx. You've got general emotional turbulence happening in their life. And then you've got the panic. And the panic causes the light to crash into the emotional turbulence, which knocks the person off. And that can create all kinds of dark psychological fracturing. That's what we call shviras hakalim, because the light coming in breaks the vessels rather than healing vessels. And if people want to learn the Kabbalah of how that works, we can go into that one day. But the first thing is the distinction that Nathan made is the distinction between the experience and the interpretation of the experience is your window to be able to shift them around. Because if you can grab hold of their das, as we said, when a person is a therapist, a coach, a spiritual guide, you are the surrogate das for that person. If you could teach them how to reinterpret that, if you could hold space for them, if you could show them that they are not the experience, but they are separate, the observer of the experience. Das, Dalai, ayin is flipped over the letters, aid, witness. Das, consciousness, is witness. You shift them back into the witnessing consciousness, then they can take control of the wave and they can release the chaos, and then they can try and ride it into a more positive place and ideally land the plane. Sounds easier than it is, but it's always easier once you know how. So these are some of the elements at play. Nathan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. The sleep one is very crucial too. For that subsection of people that we've encountered on the far end of the impairment spectrum, and you know, dealing with more psychosis-like effects and ones which, you know, continued for a while. Sleep was a major factor, you know, coming off of it. Sometimes happens on meditation retreats that, you know, your sleep is reduced anyways. And then that can get compounded. And then you have, you know, maybe a small opening and you're flooded with energy, and then you can't fall asleep that night. And then the second day, you know, everything just starts to amplify. And so we've also seen a very strong correlation with lack of sleep, and particularly these much more extreme kinds of experiences. So that's always something to be looking for, to be monitoring when somebody's coming in, you know, reporting things. Sleep, you know, the other thing would be, you know, food. So fasting isn't, well, I guess there are Jewish traditions which advocate fasting for different capacities too, but it's another thing which, like sleep deprivation, can help amplify and you know, help bring somebody into a spiritual experience, but it can also really amplify negative and challenging experiences too. So if somebody hasn't really been eating very much and or hasn't really been sleeping very much, those would be two, you know, warning signs to you know, help kind of push people back into a more regulated state. And the third point just to note is you know, a helpful sort of diagnostic category or framing right now that people are talking about, or just, you know, what's somebody's window of tolerance. So I just wanted to share, I don't know if that's something that you've talked about in the program already.
Let's hear.
Well, I just want to share this little diagram here.
I gave you sharing rights. Leave it. I see. Okay. Actually, we're going to come back to it after this. Yes.
Yeah, just want to do this real quick. So, you know, this is something coming. Yeah, that's not mine. This is coming out of, you know, particular trauma research, which is a section of this research and looking at the ways that trauma interacts with these kinds of experiences. And certainly for people who, you know, have experienced different kinds of trauma in their life, it's something to keep an eye on. It doesn't mean you can't meditate. It just means that, you know, you want to be particularly attentive to the kinds of meditation and when you're doing it, and if or when, you know, traumatic experiences may, you know, re-experiencing or might arise during practice. So this is just a good general kind of framework talking about the window of tolerance here, which is basically what I heard you, Rav Katz, talking about, and that both sleep deprivation and, fasting, and or other stresses in your life, and or, just challenging things happening, challenging circumstances in your life can push you out of your window of tolerance, which is when, maybe a negative experience might come up during meditation or just in our lives. And if we're within our window of tolerance, then it's not going to cascade into these much bigger and much more impairing kinds of effects. And this may also, shift what kinds of practices we do at various times. So, there may be particular practices that when we are outside of our window of tolerance, we use to actually get back in, and that's great. That's a part of, teaching that I've heard you teach about, Rav Katz, of what does it mean to have eyes in your head, right? Like, what does it mean to really know, okay, where am I? Do I have my resources? Is this a time to really be, engaging with some challenge, some difficulty, some problematic relationship in my life right now that's coming up? Or, this is coming up in my practice right now, but I am exhausted. I've had a really difficult day. Let's save this till tomorrow. Let's save it to the weekend when I can talk about it with a friend, with a mentor, or something like that. So this is just I can also post this. This is freely available.
Can you talk us through the details of this, Nathan? It's really interesting. And
yeah, I mean, this is, trauma research is not an area of my specialty. So this comes out of, there has been a book on, what was it called? I forgot. It's by David Trelevin, Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, something like that. So he has some, helpful guidance in terms of, working with people and doing meditation with people with trauma. But yeah, basically, I mean, these are two, ways that you can get out of your window of tolerance, either becoming hyper aroused, which, as it says, at the extreme end is you're feeling very anxious or angry, out of control. There's a kind of in-between period where you're dysregulated, but not in this hyper aroused state where you just feel off or agitated, right? That would be a sign to you like, ooh, okay, I'm getting a little bit out here. Maybe don't do things that I know that are going to cause me to become even more out of control, more anxious, more angry. And then on the flip side is, becoming hypo-aroused, which is feeling zoned out, numb, dissociated, emotionally and physically. And again, the extreme end of that is you can be, completely frozen or completely dissociated. People could be completely zoned out. That's something certainly also to be keeping an eye out for in students if we're working with them in person or otherwise. But even the signs as they're getting towards it, people just getting a little spacey, losing track of time, starting to feel sluggish. So this is just kind of a, very basic framework. Obviously, the trauma research is much more detailed and sophisticated than this, but this is just kind of a helpful framework to have. And I think it's just sort of, a lot of what you just shared, Rav Katz, translated into some more clinical terms.
It's a pretty graphics. That's great. Thank you for sharing. If you could unshare your screen so we can see your face again.
Sure.
Let me ask a kind of bottom line question. Is the lab and your research up to a point yet where there's kind of a first aid advice being prepared? Like if a person sees X, Y, and Z, we should do X, Y, and Z. Is the answer always get to a psychiatrist, a psychologist? Is there any practical guidance that teachers of how to react in real time if they have concerns about students?
Yeah, I mean, there's some general guidance, things like, don't be afraid of like psychotherapy. If somebody is reporting things that are, and you're not a clinician and they're very serious clinical issues, don't try to take those on yourself. Just generally, psychotherapy can be a really helpful adjunct to all sorts of different meditative practices. It gets, certainly when people get into these more like extreme states of either hyperarousal or hypoarousal, then there are some, techniques and practices like you talked about that are ways of getting people regulated enough, right, to kind of when they're in crisis mode. And so you may not be able to, immediately take them, if somebody shows up to you in one of these states. So there are some, helpful tools and practices that you can do to kind of help re-ground people, right? The language of kind of grounding is really important in this sort of domain. There are other resources I can also share this. There is a nonprofit that's associated with the research that we've been done. It's called Cheetah House. It offers a lot of information about a lot of these different categories. You can also
what was the title of that? Cheetah House?
Yeah, it's called cheetahhouse.org.
CHEETAH?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't remember if it's 2 H's or not.
Catchy name.
Yeah, not particularly relevant to the topic, but so that has a lot of practical advice. There is also a 3-hour training course that's specific to teachers and clinicians in working with meditation related difficulties. So I would highly recommend that for people if they're interested specifically in, these more trauma sensitive kinds of approaches, or at least how to identify when these things come up. Yeah. And then beyond that, there's a lot that we talk about just in terms of working with people. It's a lot of things that you've already shared in terms of working with intention and what are people really seeking in this practice and where are they in their lives? And is this like a pretty, basic introductory level practice, or is this quite an advanced practice? And obviously for those more advanced practices, a lot more conditions are probably need to be met to be able to engage in them safely. It doesn't mean never do them. It just means, be more conscientious about them. So, that's, yeah.
I just want to reiterate that point. When I met with also from Nathan Zab, Dr. Willoughby Britton, I kept pushing on a point, I wanted to know what the most extreme advice was. Is this dangerous? Should people not meditate? What would be and they kept saying, no, you should do it, and you should do it. You just have to be careful. You have to be cautious. You have to be aware. You have to be mindful. So even the main research is seeing the biggest risk. There was no point that we're saying, again, I'm now just talking to the most elemental level. There's no point when they were saying, don't do this or cut back, or it's so high risk. The doctors, they were all saying, be aware, be sensitive, and move forward. That is the advice. We're not telling you something that this is after a year of learning this together, this is a disaster learn. We're putting it in the context of what it really is, right? Proceed forward, enjoy, be sensitive and aware. There's one point which I want to flag. This is a very complex, controversial discussion point, and we're not going to go into it today. But if you don't know anything about what I'm about to say, and you're serious about pursuing this field in depth, you really have to do your research here. And I'm not taking sides, which usually means I see truth in either side, and you could probably guess which side I'm more anointed to. But when a person has psychological breakdowns, when a person has psychological issues, when they're opened up and there's an imbalance happening, so the normal professional response is get this person to a therapist, get this person to a psychiatrist, get this person to some kind of hospital, because that is the modern scientific, healthy, professional way to deal with these things. But there is a whole group of people out there in the thousands and the tens of thousands. And again, I'm not saying not to do anything. I'm just telling there's two sides who have had nightmare experiences with that process. They felt they're connected to spiritual, energetic breakthroughs, but having complexities. And when they went into those environments, their claims are they were met with small-minded doctors. They were given prescription medicines that made it worse. They were put in environments that were so setting, so hostile, it triggered more trauma and bigger issues. And there's a whole industry, I don't know the word industry is right, of people saying there has to be a different approach. So it's a very, very complex thing. The statement I should be making is seek professionals. If these kind of risks, go and seek psychological, psychiatric professionals in this. but there's also tremendous risk. There's tremendous risk of deep misunderstanding of these, the spiritual emergency or the spiritual emergence. And it's treated like a medical, it's treated like a, we have to diagnose, we have to throw drugs at it. And there's a lot of people that have had tremendously traumatic experiences. I'm talking thousands of people. And it's starting to become a very important dialogue that takes place online with different advocacy groups and different things like that. So it's not simple which way to go. There's, in all these discussions, always two extremes. And if you listen to both extremes, one is everyone needs medicine, everyone needs to be locked up. And the other is no, everything is, a spiritual evolution and it's fine with a spiritual guide. And as always, there's truth to both sides and lies to both sides. And it's really, really complex. So I will leave my particular guided details on this for another discussion, another time, or we can research it more in depth. But if you don't know what I'm talking about and you haven't heard those voices and concerns, educate yourself. It's very, very important.
Yeah,
okay.
I just wanted to add real quick, and this is something that Miriam just mentioned too, that, again, there are psychotherapists and clinicians who themselves are, meditation practitioners or spiritual practitioners who are much more familiar with kind of territory themselves personally. So again, that should also be a factor in terms of, if you're working with someone or referring someone, if you decide to do so, that, you're not just necessarily like sending somebody to a psychiatric clinic, but you could send somebody who I know there are psychotherapists here in this room. So, there is a lot of people who are really trying to educate themselves and to bridge this gap, which, people fall through the cracks on both ends, as you just said. And the other thing just to add is, people use different metaphors for this kinds of stuff, but, the scuba diving metaphor is often a good one that, at 10 feet down, right? There's not so much guidance. You can jump into a pool and swim 10 feet down and you don't really need, machinery and a tank and stuff like that. But if you're starting to dive down, like, 50, 60 feet, that's when there starts to become real training about, okay, how do we slowly get down to these depths? How do we use the tank? Do we have a buddy system?
If you're going to the Pardes, it's all the way down, right? That's what we're saying.
So, that's another one. And, everything also has adverse effects, right? Like, Advil has adverse effects, psychotherapy itself has adverse effects. So it shouldn't be surprising that different kinds of meditation don't solve everything. And that's, just part of the sophistication of where we're getting to as a culture. And in this research too, is, which practices are better for which kinds of things? What are the ideal environments for getting into them? How do we really understand that? When would psychotherapy be a really helpful adjunct and when would it not be? And how to navigate different frameworks for interpreting our experiences. And, it is a complex territory, but, we're moving to address that complexity.
As Nathan was saying, there are people out there who are bridges, who are trained as psychotherapists, they're trained as psychiatrists, and they're also spiritually sensitive and they do mindfulness work. If you don't know anyone like that, so it's your job as a meditation teacher to know people like that. It's your job to find excellent psychologists and therapists, psychiatrists that you refer to all the time. Right? Again, if you can do that work, that's wonderful. If someone else does that work better, you're not there to serve you, you're there to serve your students, right? And part of serving your students is to have extra resources that you build around you, that you can highly, joyfully recommend and confidently recommend people to. Let's go to some more questions. How do you have a question right now? Liba, you're still waiting with a question? You're on. Just reminding everyone to keep the questions as short and tight as possible so we can cover as much ground as we can.
Great. Thanks. This is really a fascinating conversation. And I had a whole roll of questions, but I'm going to narrow it down to, I think, essentially one. If there is any correlation between the general society of people and the people in that society who have psychotic breakdowns and the meditation society and psychotic breakdowns, because like I'm listening to you, Rav Doniel, to hear what, like the different levels of consciousness. And basically that's all of our experience, is that we have middos, we have issues. We have stress, we lack sleep, we go through different types of trauma, most everybody on the planet. So is the same thing that would prevent most of us from having psychotic breaks in our regular life, does that disappear during meditation? Or is there a correlation between the percentages of people in the regular society and people in the meditation world? I guess is there a transfer of percentages?
Nathan?
So one is that we don't have that data on an empirical level. So everything I say from here forward is pure speculation. But there are a couple of factors that I would say would be important. One is just like, I've spent time in a lot of different spiritual communities, and oftentimes there's a kind of a self-selection of who ends up in different communities. So we might actually expect there to be slightly higher levels of mental health or different clinical disorders within certain spiritual communities, just by virtue of who is drawn in that direction to begin with. The other thing is that because so many spiritual practices have been marketed to us as psychotherapeutic tools, and some of them are helpful and effective. So now a lot of people seeking, help for otherwise clinical issues end up in, doing various kinds of spiritual practices. And sometimes they are helpful for people and other times they aren't, particularly more advanced practices, which often end up being more deconstructive. We're really trying to rewire our normal functioning and our habituated processes. And some of them can be quite aggressive in the ways that they are trying to rewire. So for people, dealing with serious shock or strain trauma, those things can be really destabilizing without yet having a new equilibrium that people are working on to move into. So if you're just trying to deconstruct all of our defense mechanisms that exist right now, well, your defense mechanisms are there for a reason, so if you all of a sudden just take away all of those safeguards, so that is one of the contexts in which we can sometimes see psychotic-like phenomenology. And I do think that's both for when psychotic episodes happen to the general population is under, very stressful or otherwise, challenging circumstances. And we also see that within meditation. Again, the sleep one is a big one, I would emphasize, or in a meditation retreat setting. Again, that's going to the 50, 60, 70 feet down. If you're just focusing on a meditation practice for a weekend or for a week, right, that deserves a little more special care and safeguards to do it, and they can be powerfully transformative if those are in place.
On that subject, Nathan, it's interesting. It makes me think of when we first did Elevation, the seminars in New York, and we did a 2 or 3 day one. I remember that it was really wonderful. There's always a blessing in the first one you do, and we got lots and lots of wonderful thank you, it was transformative, whatever. And this one guy, I remember, just sent the one exception to the rule, just literally swearing abusive words and screaming. I was but what he said was, you didn't feed us, and we hardly slept, and we were going all this kind of stuff. He says, I know why you were doing it. He said that was a brainwashing technique, and he said that's what they used to do in the CIA, and that's what they used to do is they don't feed you and they don't let you sleep, and so therefore you become more susceptible. There's a lot of people that have told me who've been to Tony Robbins events is, they go to 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and then they start again at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, however they do it. And that's actually built into the system, right? Because, I've never used that technique, because for me, I'm much, if I want people to have much more subtle awareness and sensitive awareness in states, I want people to sleep as much as possible. It doesn't mean at the Morocco trip we got much sleep. That's because we're all high and connected. And that's the point Nathan's speaking to, which is when you're in environments of spiritual seeking and you're pushing yourself more and you're more likely to get less sleep, the positive is it's taking down your ego defenses right? As in hypnosis, they call it the critical mind or whatever, right? That says, I want to experience, I don't. You're just wide open. So the positive wide open means that you can go high and fast, simple. The negative is that if you get crashed, you crash down. And so it's just something to hold in mind. It's techniques used by the CIA, which is sleep deprivation, but it's all trying to affect the same mechanism. They're trying to break people down and make people open to suggestion, right? Because that means that they don't have the defense mechanisms. And there's the positive, negative of that. One other thing, it just reminded me, a personal story, what Nathan was saying, is when I was in my early 20s and not yet religious and started to have these very transformative kind of mind-melting spiritual experiences. I remember a day, I was starting to feel out Shabbat and what it was like to keep Shabbat. And in Melbourne, I was living in my cool apartment and being an artist and a film director, but kind of walking half an hour to the religious area to keep Shabbos. And I remember one Shabbat morning waking up after having a few weeks of incredible high spiritual experiences. And I remember getting out of bed, and I'm 26, 25, 26, technically I'm a mature adult. And I suddenly had this sense that if God is everywhere and God is around me and God is watching me, I can never escape from him. Now, some of you may go, yeah, I'm sure that's what you religious people feel all the time. But I wasn't in a religious, Haredi, full of fear mindset. I was in a, coincidentally blowing out of my body and having very weird, intense experiences, as we've discussed before. But suddenly that thought and awareness, that critical awareness hit my mind in a way it hadn't before. Until then, it hit my mind in a way I would kind of launch out of my body to profound experience. At that moment, I got back under my covers and hid under my blanket and didn't get out of there for like 3 or 4 hours because I wanted to be hidden, right? Now I'm, relatively speaking, I guess you can decide whether I'm a healthy person or not, but whatever I was now I was then as well. But it was this intense fear that overcame me. And the fear was a result of awareness of divine consciousness and its intensity. And while that was a launch into profound spiritual development in general, at that moment, it really crashed me. And it's interesting to reflect on, what happened then that the other times took me up, but that took me down. And that fear, I remember saying it, the feeling was total overwhelm of divine awareness. Now, if somebody came to me with that, I would say in hindsight, that was part of my increased sensitivity. Because if you're aware of the divine, you're aware of that light, and you're aware of that obligation to be spiritually attuned, then suddenly you realize that can be overwhelming, but that overwhelming is part of the development. So my guess is, as Nathan was saying at the beginning, is that the path or is that pathology? So my guess is the beginning of a conversation we can discuss over many years is they're not really different, right? For me, that seemed to be a minor pathology on the path that for others could have become a permanent pathology, not because I'm better, just because it didn't go there. So in that moment, I was taken down, but for some reason it stabilized and became an important developmental moment. But for other people, if there's more trauma, more anxiety, less sleep, that moment itself could have taken them down. So, the path of the pathology, I think, is sometimes one and the same, but there's a certain blessing that keeps a person on the right path. Speaking of blessings, I want another point that I see Rina has a hand up. I cannot emphasize enough in the scientific discussion and the scientific research, and science will say, what about sleep and what about food and what about, trauma and what about these things? So let's just all hold in mind, which is very, very key to Torah's understanding of this, and is very, very key to all wisdom traditions. If a person's ever been at ayahuasca ceremony, so they do this thing called smudging, which is energetic cleaning. So Torah 101, if you read what it says, Chaim Vital says in Shari Kedusha, the whole process a person must go into when they're prepared. Talk about set and setting, right? You have to do tshuva. You have to be learning Torah. You absolutely have to go to the mikveh. All the tzaddikim said you have to purify your body and your mind before, right? You have to fix a very clear intent. You have to surround yourself with holy things. You have to go into a room when you can't hear anyone else. The Baal Shem Tov is clear that even if there's sounds of people in the house, he says thoughts of negative, how's this for set and setting? He says thoughts of negative people around you can influence your state when you're in that place. So he says you have to be, completely alone. They said dress in white because dressing white is a way we purify ourselves and open it up. The Kabbalists, as they went in their state, they would wrap themselves in a talus. So there was something very, very important, something that Nathan and I, another example that Nathan and I even discussed once, and I was excited to get this piece of data from him. The intent of the teacher in the room, which we just did 2 classes on, right? The intent of the teacher in the room, his kashrus between the group and the choice to elevate the people. When people are looking to you and they're attentive to you and they're listening to your voice, then they're hyper attuned to your consciousness. If God forbid you were looking at something bad, if you were eating the wrong food, if you were in the wrong destructive state of anxiety, your consciousness as the Baal Shem Tov, the Tzaddikim, can, God forbid, affect them, take them down. So, one of the ideas is the tzaddik in the room, you bring tzaddikim into the room, you light candles, right? You bring positive energy into the room. And you tell people to tune to the highest states, to fix the holy intent, to align with tzaddikim, to think about divine names. You get everyone to do tshuva. If there's sins, negative angels around them, we've discussed that can totally drag them down before. In ayahuasca, in many traditions, you fast for multiple days before. Remember, this was Matan Torah. They fasted for days before. They didn't have physical intimacy with days before because the body then has a energetic imprint of that can take them into a lustful, desirous place rather than to Tana Galaki, to the divine pleasure. So the energetic cleansing is a protection, and I'll say that the minimum about this, from negative forces, negative energy, things that we call shindalids, things that we call the Kali. All these forces can, will, and do influence people. This is the dark side of drugs, which the world of psychedelics is so in its early romantic buzzy phase that I don't think yet they'd be realistic with the side and with the risks of this. And there are many people starting more and more to report challenges from this, is that there are negative forces out there. This is, every wisdom tradition has this core, and Torah is full of this. And you have to cleanse and energetically protect yourself from this. Again, if you're doing mindfulness, for most people, this will not be an issue, for most people. But when you're doing deeper work and deeper Devekas work, I've told you before, when you're working on Ruach HaKodesh Ma'at, when you're working in intuitive work, my friends, a lot of what we receive, the mystics say, is bad information. Things we think is intuitive download is bad information from shindalids, from negative forces, energies around us. Sometimes when we get a true, incredible insight, sometimes it can be from a source of kedusha, of holiness, and sometimes the mystics say it can be from a shindalid, a negative force, giving us something true so that we learn to trust it more, so then it can then send us insane and take us over. So these are long discussions, what to trust and what not to trust. But we can't emphasize enough that the Kabbalists discuss explicitly, as do the Hasidic masters, that part of the dark night of the soul and the darkness and the trigger effect is created by negative energies and negative forces that are looking to susceptible people to influence them. And one of the signs of a susceptible person is a person that's involved in unhealthy things emotionally, unholy things in their life, and then they drop a little liquid, and then they take a little tablet and they say, now I'm just going to completely energetically open myself. And the negative forces go, what a fantastic window to come in, because what they need to come in is what's called chet, is an energetic block, a spiritual disruption, an intense emotional trauma, a lack of emunah, a lack of health. That's their source in. The most important and terrifying work of the whole Jewish tradition is a sefer work called Minchas Yehuda by Yehuda Fataya, which I think is the most important and most traumatizing work of our tradition. And it's a Kabbalist from the time of 100 years ago, talking about dibukim and exorcisms and all these kind of things. And the forces themselves, he's writing a journal of the things he did. And the forces themselves actually talk about how they choose who to enter, why they enter, and it's all these kind of things. So the true understanding of these dark nights of the soul is more than a discussion of, it's absolutely lack of sleep and it's absolutely trauma and emotional turbulence and all these things, but there's absolutely, in all the major wisdom traditions, this element as well. That a person has to do these deep dives with Kedusha and Tahara, the environment you're in, the house, there's I have to be careful what I say. There's a person who told me recently that they were going out in a forest and they were doing trips in a forest, and then they had a very, very red trip there. I've heard this a few times before, because it's beautiful to be out in nature, but there's energetic forces in forests as well. And there's some forests have kedusha, and some forests have darkness, and there's all kinds of different things. I can tell you my own experiences about being in Morocco. And Morocco is known as being a very spiritually impure place because there used to be great tzaddikim there, but there was also a lot of mechashafim there. And when the tzaddikim left, when the light leaves and the darkness comes into that, and that allows us to be much more vulnerable to these forces, that can affect people physically, emotionally, without going into more details and stories. That created challenges for us when in Morocco. So this is a core part of the situation. And when you're teaching real stuff and intense stuff, we must be aware of the kedusha, the tahara, the purity of the situation. And if your students can't be aware of it, then you have to find ways to bring holiness to that room and that space. You have to choose the environments that you're in. Again, not just set and setting as in the traditional sense of making sure it's a healthy, balanced, supportive, loving, compassionate, still quiet, peaceful, right? But also bringing in the spiritual consciousness element aware, being aware of what's energetically there in that environment. Something to hold in mind. Rena, you had a question.
You answered my question with everything that you just said. You totally answered. My question was, what's the spiritual Kabbalistic explanation of what happens when people meditate and how they are vulnerable to both positive and negative influences, and how can they protect themselves so what they're drawing down is purely holy and positive versus tapping into something that is impure and negative? And how do you protect your energy field, which is what you explained. The only other question I had, just as a follow-up to everything you just said just now, is I learned this once, that that the actual tefillah, that the words of the tefillah that we have in the formal prayers, that they're not just, energy forces that, plug you into Hashem, but they're more like protection. It's sort of like a holy shvil, like a path, like a spiritual path, so that when you do connect, you're surrounded by light and you're protected because the holy words are your protection. Right. So I guess I just wanted to learn more from the Kabbalistic side. What are the things that we can do so that when we are vulnerable and open and receptive, that we're always drawing from the higher space versus from the other side? So
this is the idea, right? So we've learned the secret before in the course on healing, which is to the degree that I'm connected to Hashem, there's no force negative that can affect me. And there's a way we connect to Hashem in consciousness called the Vekas. There's a way we connect to Hashem in our beliefs. There's a way we connect to Hashem in mitzvahs and stay away from averas. When we eat tray food, when we, God forbid, spilling of seed, when we do all these things, when we speak Lashon Hara, we're creating very intense negative energy, right? And therefore we have to purify ourselves to not be affected by that as we go up. And as Nathan says, if you're going 1 meter underwater, you can hold your breath for 10 seconds and come up. But the more you go down, what does it mean to go down? The more you relinquish your conscious control of your awareness, the more you become subtly sensitive and influenced by other forces. So the more deeper work you want to do, the more spiritually clean you need to be. There's some people say, oh, that's religious dogma, because I've been meditating for years. I've taken a couple of trips and nothing's happened, right? So that's to the degree there can be luck, there can be blessing, and there can be the clock is ticking. Do you know what I mean? It can also be that the more spiritually deeply connected you are, the much higher you could go energetically, you can open. So there's a lot of discussion here. The secret of what this rule is, which I want to avoid the strict Kabbalah tonight because I want to stay focused more and more on what Nathan has to offer. This is Kabbalistically the rule called kapanim bapanim and acha ba'acha. So just to touch literally for 1 minute on the Kabbalistic language. So we know that there's the masculine, feminine, which is called Zar and Nuk, which is all of reality is about the Adam and Eve, that they were back to back. And now, and through the whole tikkun of the world, through the whole healing, the olam of tikkun, then they return to face to face. Now, the deep reason why they're back to back is because, again, so this is a little advanced, and I don't want to explain it because it's going to take us 3 hours, but I just want to say it so it's in your head and the seeds are planted. So at least whenever we go into this again, or it comes up, you're a little like, oh, this is somehow connected to that. The reason they're back to back is because the front of a person is your light and is your core energy. And when you are illuminated, the negative forces can't touch you. The negative forces, the Kali, they want your light. What's the idea that negative forces and bad energies and vampires come out at night, right? And vampires run away from the sun. So the vampires, literally all the rules of vampires from the Lost Boys and any good high quality, high Kabbalah movie is always literally 101 Kabbalah, right? So that vampires want the light, they want the blood, they want chiyus. The clippers want to be yonic, they want to draw the light. But if the light is too big, they can't access it. A negative energy, a clipper can't stand before Hashem because they would be evaporated before Hashem. So they want to grab the light, but they have to grab it through the back end, through the back door. So that's why negative forces come out with the moon at night, because the moon is a reflection from the sun. It's not high enough to evaporate them, but it's enough that they can still draw from the energy. So the lesson in Kabbalah is that the negative energies draw from our backside. Our backside is our blind side. We can't see there. It's the side of excretion, right? It's the side of the negative side, the darkness side. So the idea is that energetically, the clippers want to draw our energy, that we are the source of energy, but they can only get it by coming into the back. The back has enough of our energy, but it's not so bright it destroys them. So Adam and Eve, the reason that the world is hidden from its divine nature is because the Mashpia, which is Adam, which is called Zer and Pin, can't yet shine the light into the moon, the Nukva, the feminine, because she's not ready to receive. That means if I would have the infinite light download into me right now, my heart is so full of fear and panic and ego. This is exactly the same as many people. And this is also, we should talk about it. It's different, but also connected to what Nathan's here to teach us, right? Which is the idea that many people have spiritual experiences and they become big Balgaivas from it, rather than becoming humble for it. This is the problem with, the guru effect, is they become super egotistical. And it's because rather than the light diminishing their ego, it actually inflames their ego. I'm so spiritual, look what I can do. And that's when you see a lot of terrible things that gurus do because of that. So the idea is that the masculine energy can't shine into the lower or the feminine energy until she is cleansed and purified so she's able to receive that. So I'm getting too caught in the details, but the core is that they have to exist back to back. Because until the world is perfected, there's so much negative energy and destructive forces in the world that if they turn face to face, all lovers want to be face to face. That means they're connected. The light from the high world is connected to the low world. The light of our soul is connected to the light of our heart, right? That's the spiritual experience. All spiritual experience is called panim b'panim. That's the two keruvim in the temple. When Hashem loved Klal, they were facing face to face. What happens when they face to face? Their backs are left open. Their backs are left open. They're susceptible to negative influence. So they can't turn face to face until there's been a purification process. When people have psychotic breakdowns or spiritual breakdowns from a spiritual experience, it's usually because they're turning to face the light, but they haven't purified themselves. And therefore they become spiritually vulnerable and open. And rather than the light releasing and healing the trauma, which is all the breakthrough work we've been learning, the amount of work we're doing, right? What it actually does is it grabs onto the trauma and amplifies it in order to destabilize and crash the individual. So we can only Kabbalistically come together panim b'panim when we've purified ourselves, purified our heart, purified our vessels, elevated our consciousness, elevated our lives in Kedusha and Tahara. And then we can open up completely and be taken into revelation completely leave in peace and return in peace. Shalom, peace, means shlemut. Shlemut means harmony, unity, integration, that all my faculties, the emotions, the body are there, are fully present, fully on, fully engaged, and fully united, right? So the idea in Kabbalah is that when I open up myself completely, but I'm not purified and not ready, then the light floods in, but it crashes me. And that's called the Shviras HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. But if I can purify and elevate myself first, and through tshuva and through amuna and through eating the right food and all the right mitzvahs the right way, then at that moment when the light comes in, I'm cleansed and I'm protected from the outside. That's what it means, panim b'panim. Zah and Nuk, the masculine and feminine energy, the higher and lower waters can unite together in intimacy, and they can turn face to face because there's nothing destructive in the world to do that. That's the process of Rosh Hashanah, of Yom Kippur, of Sukkot, of Simchas Torah. Simchas Torah is what's called panim b'panim. Because of Rosh Hashanah, we did tshuva and we purified ourselves. And on Yom Kippur, we elevated ourselves and released everything. Then we can have the joy of zivug, of the unity of masculine and feminine. And now we can have the highest state of revelation, and without being any negative forces around us. And that's the beauty of that day. So that's off the topic, but it's a little of how the Kabbalists discuss this. Hands up if you've got questions right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Hands up if you've got questions right now. Does anyone else have questions? I don't see any other questions right now. We don't have much more time. Nathan, what else is integral for us to hear? I hope it's not the last time we hear from you. What are other key things you think need to be spoken about in the subject that we all need to learn from you now?
I think we've touched on a lot of things. Obviously, there's a lot more information or resources on any one topic that we touched on. So again, I'm happy to provide some more resources. I also think like some people in the chat were talking about, trying to put together a list of psychotherapists and resources that they know of people who themselves are familiar with this territory. And I think that's a great idea, that this community has a lot of resources and, could put together something like that, I think is a wonderful idea. This is where also the kind of the person-centered or the group-centered approach is more relevant too. I mean, there's a chapter that I wrote specifically looking at, challenges and difficulties within Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. And, that actually goes into, well, what is the dark night of the soul within the Christian context, but what's the correlate within, the Jewish and the Islamic context? Like, what are the difficult stages of the path that are to be expected, and what are they for? And so this is something that I know you have talked about, Rav Katz, or at least we've talked about it together too. It's that once we start being able to access expansive states of consciousness, mochen de gadlut, or devekus at different levels, that it becomes it's a slightly different territory now. We're no longer talking just about diving under like 10 feet. As you mentioned, some of the spiritual considerations and dangers within the tradition as they've been passed on. But, that would be more on the interpretation of like, okay, this is something to definitely stay away from, to protect against, right? But the other side of like when mochen de katnut is actually part of a greater developmental process and a kind of an organic process. That's something that, you'd be able to speak to much more than I would, but, that's a whole nother kind of conversation that we haven't exactly gone into, and maybe that's not where people are.
We know we haven't talked about it too much in this course, but it's really key to all these things is the chayas ratzu v'shuv, which is the idea that the energy of consciousness is always expanding and contracting, but ultimately, as Nathan said, a process, an evolutionary process. You go through highs, you go through lows, and that's part of an integrative way. The high is necessary to expand the light and integrate the light. And the low is a way to then bring the light into a deeper place and to release and heal whatever was there in order to then expands higher. And that's always this kind of roller coaster that's slowly getting higher and higher. Even the Baal Shem Tov himself would go into katna states, not be able to connect sometimes with the Vekas, but realize that, that was the katniss is also a gift. I mean, that's part of it, to understand the context of the rises and falls. And it's the attitude that you have in the katniss that allows you to elevate into the gadlus in a deeper way. Rabbi Nachman is really the king of giving chizuk and giving clarity. Like, I used to have, at the beginning of my spiritual journey, very intense highs and extremely intense lows. Often, sometimes because of the highs, when you experience what spiritual connection can be like on a supernatural level, it's even harder to handle the everyday mundane experiences of life. And it was Rav Nachman's voice and Rav Nachman's teachings, especially a sefer called Meshivas Nefesh, where he actually began to talk about this. Your consciousness will rise and fall, and here's what you need to do when it rises, here's what needs to be fall. It was like the first time I heard really practical spiritual advice. So if these are things you're not familiar with, you should be looking them up, you should be reading them. They're very important subjects. And it's also about, it's about that idea that, spiritual wisdom, Torah wisdom, is giving you context to understand where you are on the map, how to maximize the experience at any given moment, not to be panicked and overwhelmed by that. And that awareness, that wisdom gives you an awareness, allows you to hold space and be aware of each experience, be aware of the value of the different moments. That's as Nathan says, the Baal Shem Tov teaches the Chacham Einav B'Roshai, that a wise person or a spiritually connected person always has their eyes in their head, meaning always is watching their consciousness. Where am I up to? Am I expanded right now? I always teach people, you need to know at any given moment, are you in das, a moichen de gadlus, a moichen de katnus? You begin on, today I'm a little triggered, today I'm a little tired, today I need to connect a little higher, today I need to draw in Kedusha. That's like just maintenance, that's psychological, spiritual maintenance, which is deeply necessary. There's a lot to talk about there. Nathan, I have maybe a last question for you. Ideally, funding and talent permitted, what's the future of your research and the lab's research in the next 5 years? Where do you see this going, and how exciting could it get?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one direction of research in this kind of the natural trajectory is moving more into, those questions around like prevalence and around a lot more people, and, what percentage of people who do this kind of practice with this kind of background or these kinds of vulnerabilities or just all of these different factors. I mean, that's something that we don't yet know, because, even interviewing 100 people, or even the one study that did, 1,000 people, that's still like relatively small and particular, and we don't know all what's relevant there. So I do think it's starting to move into more, kind of epidemiological, just like larger swaths of people. And that's where the research is going. And that's something we very much need. And, hopefully born out of that will be much more particular practical advice about, people coming in with these kinds of experiences, this is a good place to start. These are practices we don't want to do initially. These are some helpful safeguards. So, we are still just in early days of that. Yeah, I mean, there's just all kinds of other really juicy questions. I mean, one of the questions that I'm working on in my dissertation is looking at, what I call these like nonlinear trajectories of growth. And, it's also maybe true that almost all growth happens non-linearly. I mean, this is certainly all throughout Jewish sources too. The seed has to decompose first before new life comes forth. That all organic growth, goes through these kinds of breakdown before new life is coming forth. So that's something that I'm particularly interested in, and looking at. I mean, there's starting to be like psychotherapeutic research that's just looking at, the fact that things sometimes get worse before they get better in the ways that they do. Just looking, for me, I'm really interested from just looking at human beings and our bodies and our minds as dynamic systems, and how, system change and grow and develop in that sense. But also more research about, what are these new states of equilibrium or stability that these kind of nonlinear or cyclical spiral trajectories lead to, and what do those look like, and what do they, taste like? That's certainly something I'm still interested in personally, but from a research side, what does flourishing really look like? Are there various rungs on this ladder that may be amenable to some insight from, various scientific perspectives? What are if we talk about where the two seas are coming together, the two waters, where are the areas that the scientific lenses can actually also, it not just be a one-way street from the sources within the tradition, but can enlighten and bring to the forefront, maybe certain positions that didn't get extrapolated on, or more refined methods at being able to match practices and approaches to particular people, the ways in which it could be a genuine conversation and dialogue between the scientific methods and, these religious traditions, and not just a one-way street in either direction.
Yeah, you set up, I had the thrill to go with Nathan to, where was that? Outside of Boston somewhere, to the Mind and Life Institute, and there was a 2-day symposium where we met with some scientists and Sufis and Christian kind of meditative teachers. And, there's a tremendous dialogue. Do you see, is there windows, besides theoretically, is there windows for more of those things to happen? As everybody said there, really Buddhism is the main school where the scientists are focusing on now. In a realistic way, is there interest or not so much yet that the Torah could contribute more in that dialogue?
Yeah, I do think there is more interest. There's starting to be more of an awareness of, the ways that Buddhist modernism in particular has always, all religious traditions like to think that they are uniquely scientific. It was always the tact of Christianity to present itself as the uniquely rational and scientific religion, for hundreds of years. In the last 150 years, it's really been Buddhism. But there's starting to become an awareness now of like, oh, okay, no particular religion, and certainly not Buddhism, is itself a science of the mind. But how could we construct a science of the mind that does, responsibly engage with these different traditions and learn from them and see different avenues for, more discovery. So I see that tide starting to turn. I'm hoping to, be a part of that a little bit, because it's been frustrating being in some of those spaces, and this very unconscious Buddhist exceptionalism is very, very strong in those spaces. And there are finally people who are starting to call them out. There's a wonderful new book by Evan Thompson called Why I'm Not a Buddhist. And it's really kind of like, it's just like spot on and everything. And so there's starting to be more awareness there. And I'm excited about where a more balanced dialogue could be, of engaging and not prioritizing, Buddhism or any other one tradition, but really saying like, okay, so lots of different traditions, each has its own gifts, each has its own blind spots, and actually putting those into conversation in, sensitive environments like the one that we put together there in Amherst. That stuff still really excites me, that possibility. And I am optimistic about it.
Amazing. Okay, that's really wonderful, and excited to see what the next stages are. I just want to wrap up quickly. Any final, small, short questions? Anyone going to platzing that, the conversation is going to end and they miss the opportunity for the rest of their life? They're going to have complex emotional responses and trauma because, they miss that, which is going to crash them from here on in. Final opportunity.
Can I just
yes,
ask
Liba.
a practical question? Are you including in your dissertation research about different different meditative traditions or applications to particular problems, psychiatric or psychological issues? Is that something you're doing research on? Is there information out there already written on that? It's something that sounds very interesting. It'd be very interesting to break down the meditations we've learned over the past year and a half, or has it been almost 2 years, and apply them to specific issues. I mean, that would be a really fascinating project to see what works with what. I'm sure you have that already, Rav Katz. But
let's see what Nathan has to say.
yeah.
Well,
also,
yeah,
Sounds like
in your
it's early
research.
days.
That's the other, in the more applied direction. I mean, first was really trying to like get a sense for this landscape, and then, we don't want to start trying to apply things when we don't have a clear enough picture of really what's going on. But that is definitely where things are going. And that is not as much a part. I mean, I'm not looking at a particular clinical disorder or challenge or something like that, but that is something that the research group that I've been collaborating with at Brown is starting to look at, and there's starting to be papers that on specific phenomenology, on specific kinds of experiences that people are reporting, or on specific, psychiatric and clinical disorders and the ways that those are interacting. So that's where I'll also share, the information for that website, which has a lot of that information too. And then also happy to continue, conversating around this. I put my email there, and I'll also, be paying attention to the elevation page there. So if people have other questions and want to keep talking about this,
That's on Workplace in a group discussion.
Workplace, right?
Correct. And I'd like to thank you for using the word conversating. That's my first initiation into that word. Who knew that was possible? I'm looking forward to using that already.
All sorts of new things every day.
Yeah, like all the research, and now a whole new word as well.
That's right.
The world is opening up for Shirka's class.
Thank
you, Nathan, for joining us. I'm sorry it takes things like this to bring us together, but I love you and miss you, and excited to continue the conversation in person one day. I hope that was fun for you all. We are continuing with our next webinar on Wednesday. We'd love to hear your feedback, takeaways, and workplace, and have a wonderful week to be continued. Over and out, my friend.